What we know about Hamilton, what most people know about Hamilton, is that he was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr and that he's on the $10 bill. And that's not enough to know, but it's not a bad place to start because it encapsulates in two emblematic incidents both the failures and the limitations of his career and the great achievements. And tonight I just want to touch on for you where he came from, what some of those achievements were, and what the failures and the limitations were, and why those happened to him as well. Hamilton, like many New Yorkers, was not born here. He was born in the island of Nevis in the Caribbean, and he was raised on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, then a possession of Denmark. The Caribbean at that time was far richer than it is today, or has ever been, and the source of its riches was sugar. The Caribbean was the producer of the world's sugar supply, and the amount of money that the production of sugar generated was simply fantastic. Unfortunately, it was held in the hands of a very small class, the planter class of the West Indies, many of whom didn't even live on their plantations. Many of them were absentees who lived in England or France or elsewhere. And tiny in numbers, they held all the wealth that was extracted from this crop. The majority of the population in the West Indies was slaves, a huge class of slave laborers. The proportion of slaves to freemen was far higher than any place in the United States, even Georgia and South Carolina, which had indigo and rice plantations of their own. On the typical Caribbean sugar plantation, the proportion of slaves to freemen was about 20 to 1. In the islands as a whole, it would be about 12 to 1. The slaves were worked very hard. It's been calculated that the average life of a slave in Jamaica, a slave brought to Jamaica, was 8 years before dying of exhaustion and overwork. And between these two classes, there was a small class of service providers of various sorts, entirely white. And it was into this class that Alexander Hamilton was born. None of the founding fathers came from as far back as he came. Benjamin Franklin was as poor, but he did not have some of Hamilton's other disadvantages. Hamilton's father, James Hamilton, was the fourth son of a Scottish laird, and he had gone to the Caribbean without prospects in Scotland. He hoped to make money there. He failed. He was not a competent businessman or seemingly competent at very much. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, kept a store, seems to have kept it very well, seems to have been a good businesswoman. Unfortunately, she and James Hamilton were not married. Rachel Fawcett had been married to a cotton planter on St. Croix, but he seems to have been brutal. She left him. She took up with James Hamilton, lived together with him for about a dozen years. They lived together as man and wife. They had two sons, James Jr. and Alexander. Then, when Alexander was 9, they moved from Nevis, where he had been born, back to St. Croix. His father left him and his family at the age of 9. Then his mother, Rachel, died when he was 11 years old. So at the age of 11, Alexander Hamilton was an illegitimate orphan living in the Sugar Islands of the West Indies. Now, he got out of that grim situation thanks to his employer. He had been apprenticed as a clerk in a merchant house in Christiansted, the main town in St. Croix. And this house was owned by a family firm named Kruger. They were a big New York firm. New York was their headquarters. They had a branch in St. Croix, in Jamaica, also in Bristol, in England. And Nicholas Kruger, who was responsible for the business in St. Croix, saw that this was a bright young man who was working for him, was very impressed with his talents, and he and some other local figures got the idea that they would send Alexander to the mainland, to the British colonies of North America, to be educated, and the thought was that he would become a doctor, come back to the islands, and practice medicine. So when he was 15 years old, he was sent, ultimately, he was sent to New York to be educated. At first, the first thought was to send him to Princeton, but Princeton wouldn't let him study at his own pace, so he went to King's College, now Columbia, and that's where he studied. It's important that New York was where he came. New York was the city in the 13 colonies whose origin was entirely commercial, whose origin and character was entirely commercial. Boston and Philadelphia were religious experiments, and still in mood theocracies, if not in form of law. New York had never been a theocracy. It was not the city on the hill. It was not the city of brotherly love. The founding myth of New York was the deal of its purchase from the Indians. And dealing and making money was what New York was about from the 1620s on. New York had been a Dutch post for extracting furs from the interior, and then it became a port. And economic activity was the heart and soul of New York. So Hamilton was coming from an economic background in a merchant house, and he was coming to the most economically oriented city in the 13 colonies. And one thing that amused me in researching this book was to see how the character of New York has not changed from the mid-18th century until now. Travelers would say things like, New Yorkers speak very fast, very loud, and all together. When they ask you a question, they give you a minute to reply, and then they break in upon you and talk away once again. Travelers also commented on the stylishness of the women, on the variety of the food that was available, on the number of the prostitutes that were available. And this was at a time when the population of New York was 20,000, and it was all Englishmen and Dutch, two ethnic groups that hardly figure here anymore. And yet the psychic energy was absolutely the same as it is today, or so it seems. Hamilton did not become a doctor. As he was studying at King's College, the revolution began. The controversies of the revolution were already happening, and he was caught up in those, and then his course was deflected into the path that his life took. I'll briefly run over his curriculum vitae. He was a colonel on George Washington's staff for 4 years. After the war, he became a lawyer and tried some of the most important post-war cases in New York City law, having to do with property rights and the rights of Tories, or people who had taken the wrong side in the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton defended their rights. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress from New York State. He was elected to the New York Assembly. He attended the Constitutional Convention as a delegate from New York. He conceived and wrote 2/3 of the Federalist Papers, and then he was picked by George Washington as former commander-in-chief to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. At that time, he was 32 years old. He continued as Treasury Secretary for 5 years. After that, he went back into private life, but he was not idle. He founded a newspaper, the New York Evening Post, which still exists, and he also took time out to go back into the Army as a major general during the war scare with France in the late 1790s. So those are the high points of a very busy life. But the main achievements, of course, are his economic policies as Treasury Secretary. And they primarily revolve around the question of our debts. We had huge debts run up during the Revolutionary War and no prospect of paying them. We'd printed a lot of paper money, which had become worthless. We took out loans in Europe, but when we became unable to pay even the interest on the loans, we found the loan market drying up. At the time that Hamilton became Treasury Secretary, our paper was selling in Europe at 25% of its value. That's all European money men thought that it was worth. And what Hamilton did was two things. He consolidated the debt, and he also decided that it should be paid off at close to par regardless of who held it. Now, the consolidation is in a way like these 800 numbers you see on TV. If you're going bankrupt, you know, call this number, you get one easy monthly payment. Hamilton took all the debts of the national government and the 13 state governments and put them together in one pot. This was politically hard to do because some state governments had already paid off their debts. And they thought, we're going to be saddled with the debts of the state governments that haven't paid off their debt. This isn't fair. Now, the problem with that was that a lot of the states that had paid their debts had done it by shady means, arbitrarily knocking off, a quarter to a half of the debt. Rhode Island had printed a lot of paper money, so there was a lot of shiftiness behind some of the moralizing Hamilton encountered. His plan to pay off debt holders without discriminating among them was bitterly opposed. And the reasoning was that here you have two debt holders. One is a soldier to whom we've given a certificate for the back pay we have owed him. The other is a speculator who has bought some soldier's certificate at a discount in hopes that the price will rise. Are you, Secretary Hamilton, prepared to pay both these men at the same rate? The man who gave his time, potentially risked his life for his country, and the speculator? And Hamilton's answer was yes, because this is the way that money markets work. This is the way markets work. You don't know what the man who sold his debt to the speculator gained by doing it at the moment he gained it. Maybe the gain to him was more important than any benefit he would have reaped if he'd held on to that certificate. Maybe he needed the money right away. Maybe he had to have it to live or for some other project of his. And so he gained by selling it, and the speculator took the risk. And it's also, Hamilton knew from his experience in this financial world that speculation heats up as the day of reckoning approaches. And so as debts were, as the prospect that the United States would pay its debts became more realistic, and as people were trading the paper faster and faster, Hamilton was not appalled by that. This is what he'd foreseen. This is what he had desired. And so he pushed ahead with his program. But even more important than what he did, and the results of it were dramatic. A few years after he'd consolidated the debt, our securities were trading in Europe at 10% above par. So they'd gone from trading at a quarter of their value to trading over their value because Europeans were so happy with American paper as an investment. Even more important than Hamilton's achievement was his vision, and his vision of what a future American economy might be. He saw it as a diverse economy, an economy that was not only farmers, which it overwhelmingly was at that time, but also merchants and also manufacturers, producers of manufactured goods. This was something there wasn't a lot of in this country, but Hamilton hoped that that would come. And his reasons were twofold. He thought a diverse economy is a more prosperous one. That's, in a way, an obvious point. But there was also a deep psychological meaning to his emphasis on diversity, because he thought that diversity would help citizens realize their potential. And I just want to read you a sentence of his from his report on manufactures. Minds of the strongest and most active powers fall below mediocrity and labor without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. But when all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and can call into activity the whole vigor of his nature. And Hamilton is writing about his countrymen, but of course he's writing about himself. Because who more easily could have fallen into mediocrity than Alexander Hamilton, living in St. Croix, orphan, illegitimate, clerking in a merchant house, with no prospects of going anywhere or amounting to anything. He had almost suffered that fate. He'd avoided it because of the luck of having a far-sighted employer, and because of his own tremendous talent. But he did not want future Alexander Hamiltons to face such heavy odds. He wanted to create a situation better than the situation he faced, and he wanted to help his fellow Americans and their successors and their future have an easier time than he himself had had. And this is what makes his program, I think, very moving and very poignant. So much for his achievement. Now, as to his failures. One cause of his failures was Hamilton himself and his own personality. Hamilton was a know-it-all. He just thought he knew every problem that came to his attention. And one problem was that he often did. And that can make it worse. I mean, some people like know-it-alls. Some people are happy to let know-it-alls, they'll handle everything, that's fine. I'll take my lead from the know-it-all. Other people hate know-it-alls, especially if they have pride in their own accomplishments or their own intelligence. And Hamilton's personality rubbed many men very much the wrong way. The most important enemy he produced in his career, as Lou has already mentioned, was Thomas Jefferson. They served together in Washington's first cabinet. Jefferson was the Secretary of State, Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and there were a number of reasons why they finally drifted apart. At first it was peaceful. The whole country was new, the whole project was new, they weren't really aware of who each of the other was. They hadn't yet found reasons to hate each other. Washington took Hamilton and Jefferson fishing for bluefish off Sandy Hook once in 1790 when the capital was still in New York. And they got along for, I would say, about a year and a half. Then the troubles began. Part of it was personal. Thomas Jefferson was a very shy man, very reserved, very polite, obviously very intelligent, but he did not conduct himself as a know-it-all. And the presence of this brash arriviste was very disconcerting to him. There's an angry letter that Jefferson wrote to Washington after they had fallen out. And in it, Jefferson uses a very revealing and ugly phrase. He says of Hamilton that his entire career, from the time that history can stoop to notice him, has been a tissue of machinations against the liberty of his country. That phrase, history can stoop to notice him, has all the pride of a Virginia aristocrat, of a slave owner, of a man in a hierarchical society who is confident of his own position and has to deal with this bastard foreigner who unaccountably has the ear of George Washington, fellow aristocrat, fellow Virginian, fellow slave owner. And it rankled Jefferson no end. Also, Jefferson had a different vision of America's economic future. Jefferson wanted to see a perpetuation of the present. He did not wish for America to have cities, to have manufacturers, to have banking and finance. He once wrote that cities add no more to the health of the body politic than sores do to a body. That was Thomas Jefferson's vision for New York, for other American cities. He didn't care if we existed or not. He was happy to have people on their farms, and that was his ideal and his idol. Finally, they differed in their approach to politics and their approach to persuading their fellow citizens. Hamilton's method of argument was always demonstration. He's one of the most productive of the founding fathers. His editor, Harold Syrett, the man who edited his collected papers, joked that the only reason they got it finished so soon was thanks to Aaron Burr. But Hamilton was extremely productive. His contributions to the Federalist Papers are 100,000 words. The Federalist Papers, each one is about 2,000 words long, and they were written at a rate of 4 a week. And as a journalist myself, I can tell you that is very fast. And when you add the fact that they're all so good, it's even faster. Another series of essays he did, the Camillus Papers, he wrote 70,000 words for those. He could just produce torrents of words, torrents of argumentation on any point. And his method was always to explain what he wanted and why he wanted it. And he was confident that once he had done that, you would agree. He was an arrogant man, but there was something very generous about his arrogance because he always assumed that once he laid out his reasons, they would be your reasons, and that you would understand it as well as he did once he explained it to you. So he operated at the level of demonstration. There are two other levels of rhetoric and politics. The highest level is inspiration. And this is a mode that short-circuits demonstration. It gets around it. It cuts through it. It can be a ringing word, such as Jefferson's in the Declaration of Independence. It can be an immortal action, such as so many in the life of George Washington. An inspiration is at the moment that you read it or hear it or see it done, you understand it without following all the steps of reasoning, and you say, yes, that's right, this is true, I can do this. Then there's a third level, which is lower than demonstration, and that is flattery. And that's telling people nothing new. It's telling them what they want to hear. It's telling them what they already believe. And Thomas Jefferson lived at the level both of inspiration and of flattery. And he could go back and forth between them, sometimes in the same piece, sometimes in the same paragraph. And Alexander Hamilton could not rise to the level of inspiration, but he would not sink to the level of flattery. And so Jefferson was both above him and below him, and that's why Jefferson beat him in the politics of their own lives and in later judgments on our part. Another enemy that Hamilton raised up was, of course, Aaron Burr. He was, in some ways, like Hamilton. They were both New York lawyers. They had both been veterans. Burr was a very brave soldier in the Revolution. He'd taken part in a quixotic attack on Quebec in the winter of 1775-76, when he was only 19 years old. He'd conducted himself with great gallantry and bravery in that battle. Burr was charming, he was intelligent, he was well-read, but Alexander Hamilton always opposed his efforts to win high office. Hamilton began opposing him in 1792 when Burr was toying with running for vice president. He opposed him in the election of 1800 when Burr and Jefferson deadlocked in the Electoral College. He opposed him again in 1804 when Aaron Burr was running for governor of New York. And I think what Hamilton saw is what any careful reader of Burr's record can see now when we're not subjected to his charm, which was that Aaron Burr was an empty man. Aaron Burr had the emptiness of a narcissist. I understood Aaron Burr like a flash when I read one footnote in a book on Hamilton that came out in about 1910. And the author had asked a very old man who'd known Burr when he was very young. Burr died in 1838, so that's how the time frame goes. He said, everybody says Aaron Burr was charming. What did that mean? And the old man said, it was the way he listened to you. He listened to you as if what you were saying was more important to him than it was to you. No flattery could be more subtle. Now, the virtuous and the wise can listen, but narcissists also listen very well, because that's all they can do. They only exist when they're having interactions with other people. When they're alone, they disappear. There's no one home. So of course they listen well. This explains Burr's conspiracy, which is outside the time frame of my book, but no one has ever been able to figure out what Burr's conspiracy was. That's because Burr hadn't figured it out. He didn't know what he was doing. He was vamping. He was going down the Ohio and the Mississippi, and he was collecting malcontents. And anybody who was malcontent would talk to Aaron Burr, and Burr would listen. And they think, he's the guy. He'll make it happen for me. I'll go with him. But they didn't realize there was no one there. Aaron Burr was like a new refrigerator. He was bright, cold, and empty. And one person who saw this was George Washington. Aaron Burr was on Washington's staff for 10 days in 1776, and no one knows what happened, but George Washington hated Aaron Burr from that day forward and went out of his way to diss him and to prevent him from getting important offices. Hamilton was another man who saw this quality in Burr and made it a point to oppose his political ambitions. So finally, in 1804, Aaron Burr runs for the governorship of New York, loses. This is clearly the end of his political career. He is on the outs with his own party. He hasn't been able to jump over to the Federalist Party, and he's had enough after all these years, 12 years of opposition, and he challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel, whose results we know. Now, the duel was scheduled for July 11th, and a week before the duel, the Society of the Cincinnati celebrated the 4th of July. And this was a group of revolutionary officers, veterans. And Hamilton was the head of the organization since the death of Washington, and Burr, as a colonel, was also a member. So they attended this meeting in New York. They were the only two at the meeting who knew that the duel was to take place. Of course, afterwards, other people who were there tried to remember what their frame of mind had been. And people seem to recall that Hamilton was very convivial, he was very high-spirited, and that he sang. He sang old military songs with the gathering. And two of Hamilton's grandsons, disagree as to what songs their grandfather sang. But one of them was a song called How Stands the Glass Around, which was thought to have been written by General Wolfe on the eve of the Battle of Quebec. Almost certainly not written by him, but that was the popular impression. And the song goes like this. How stands the glass around? For shame ye take no care, my boys. How stands the glass around? Let mirth and joy abound. The trumpets sound, the colors they are flying, boys, to fight, kill, or wound. May we still be found content with our hard fare, my boys, on the cold, cold ground. Why, soldiers, why should we be melancholy, boys? Why, soldiers, why, whose business 'tis to die? What sighing, fie, damn fear, drink on, be jolly, boys, 'tis he, you, or I. Cold, hot, wet, or dry, we're always bound to follow, boys, and scorn to fly. 'Tis but in vain, I mean not to upbraid you, boys. 'Tis but in vain for soldiers to complain. Should next campaign send us to him who made us, boys, we're free from pain. But should we remain a bottle and kind landlady, here's all again. Colonel Burr did not sing. Colonel Burr did not sing, and he left early. I could tell you a lot about the duel, a lot is known about it, but I think that's wrong. It feeds our appetite, it feeds our curiosity about duels. Dueling was an evil system. It was evil, it was irrational, it was capricious. As a gentleman, Hamilton had had a lot of experience with duels. As a second, as a potential principal in duels which had not come to the field of honor. His most recent experience had been in 1801, 3 years earlier, when his eldest son, Philip, had fought a duel. Philip was a 19-year-old man, a student at Columbia, and he'd gotten into a political argument about his father's career. And a challenge had been issued. He went to his father for advice as to what he should do, and Hamilton told him that it was wrong to kill a man in a duel, but so that he should waste his first shot, although, of course, as a gentleman, he had to fight the duel. Unfortunately, no one gave this advice to Philip's opponent. Philip's gun went off in the air. Philip was struck in the abdomen. It took him 16 hours to die, with his mother and father on either side of him on his deathbed. The scene was as horrible as can be imagined. It also struck Hamilton's second oldest child, his daughter Angelica, who was a year younger than Philip, and as a result she lost her mind. And for the rest of her life, and she lived until her 70s, she never spoke of Philip as dead. She always spoke of him as still being alive. She could not accept the fact that he had been killed. So Hamilton accepted Colonel Burr's challenge. The duel was to be held at Weehawken on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. That was the same place where Philip had been killed, and the pistols used belonged to Hamilton's brother-in-law. They were the same set of pistols that Philip Hamilton had used. The two duelists came to the field at 7 o'clock in the morning. Hamilton had told a few of his friends, and he'd also written in a letter to his wife, that his opinion of dueling was the same as it had been 3 years earlier. It was immoral to kill men in duels, and therefore he would waste his first shot. But he felt honor-bound to go through with this one. Hamilton's shot went off into the air. Burr struck him in the stomach. The bullet lodged in his spine. He was rowed back to Manhattan to the house of a friend. It took him 36 hours to die. He died on the 12th of July. The funeral was held at Trinity Church on the 14th. The eulogy was delivered by Gouverneur Morris, a longtime friend of Hamilton's, the author of the Constitution. And it's not a memorable eulogy, but Morris got one thing right, and it was the most important thing to get right. At the end of the speech, he said, he was trying to quiet the crowd. In his diary, he said, if I had been like Mark Antony, I could have driven them absolutely mad. But he was determined not to do that. And he said, he told them not to insult the offended majesty of the law. He said, this is the last message from Hamilton. You will never hear his voice anymore, so hear it from my lips. Respect yourself. I went a few months ago to the dueling ground in Weehawken, where there's a little a bust of Hamilton on a pillar and a flag. A little tiny park, and there's nothing really to see there. But if you look across the Hudson, what you do see is the Manhattan skyline. The whole thing, from the World Trade Center all the way up to Riverside Church and beyond, all the skyscrapers as if on review. And it occurred to me that if Hamilton could see that skyline, he might say, this is why I came here. This is what I worked to build. Use it. Thank you.